changed how I go out there because it is, there is a legitimate threat of many people out there wanting to do harm to me. So since the piece has come out, I've had to really limit my time out there. I meet with people in places like Lafayette or in Calcasieu Parish, which is the parish next to Jeff Davis Parish. So I've really had to radically alter how I move out there. And in fact, for the first at least 2 months, maybe even 3 months after the piece was out, I didn't even go near there. It completely stayed away. Just I wanted to have it cool down a bit. But yeah, so now, I do have to really watch myself. I don't know, though, that having a gun necessarily is going to be the best thing for me out there. I think it's more about moving in very smart ways out there when I go out there.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I know that one of the things that you found when you were in your piece is there was a lot of police involvement. Maybe nefarious is the word I would use before. And is that kind of what really rankled the feathers?
Yes, particularly the information that I got about Warren Gary and his involvement in disposing of the DNA evidence in the Kristen Gary Lopez case, and the other piece that made them very, very unhappy, which they're stuck with, and these people are not my witnesses, they're their witnesses, was I obtained dozens of task force interviews, witness interviews. Now, the task force is a multi-agency task force that was created in 2008 to investigate these homicides. And I obtained dozens of task force witness interviews. And in these witness interviews, witnesses named specific cops who they believed were involved in murders. And what so upset them about this was that for years, and going back probably to 2007 or so, when people in town started wondering about law enforcement and their potential involvement in this, law enforcement's response was, well, you're just wondering about this, you're just hearing rumors, there's nothing to it. There's nothing to this at all, don't worry, you're just hearing rumors. And what I did was, by obtaining those task force interviews, where their witnesses, and I emphasize that a lot, it's their witnesses, not my witnesses, where their witnesses named specific cops as suspects, and that upset them so much because they can no longer say it's a rumor, right? When your own witnesses are coming forward and saying, for example, Deputy Danny Berry, who's a deputy who's actually now deceased, was involved in these homicides, then you can't say it's just some guys or girls or whoever talking on the street about Danny Berry. These are actual witness statements. That completely freaked them out, and it's now destroyed their narrative. This is the narrative that they have foisted upon this case, and this is the narrative that they desperately want the town to believe, is that anything you hear about law enforcement is just a rumor. Well, that's absolute, 100% crap, and it's proven by their own witness interviews. So, it was really the two pieces of one, the statements about Warren Gary, and again, those are their witnesses, not mine. Those are witness statements taken by the Jennings police. And then it was two, the witness statements taken by the task force, where cops and sheriff's deputies are named as suspects. So it's really destroyed their narrative.
Yeah, about how many different law enforcement personnel were named?
I would say about 4 to 5.
Okay, that includes Warren Gary and Danny Berry.
Warren Gary, Danny Berry, the former warden of the parish jail, a guy named Terry Guillory, his former wife, Paula Guillory, who was the deputy with the sheriff's office. And there's quite a few, actually. And many of those people are very high-ranking. I mean, you're talking about Warren Gary was the chief criminal investigator for the sheriff's office, and Terry Guillory was the warden of the parish jail.
So, speaking of Paula Guillory, I was kind of curious. You interviewed her. So she got fired for mishandling evidence, but it looks like, yeah, and I read the sheriff's memo and everything, and it sounds he named a whole list of grievances against her, including but I noticed even though he fired her really quickly, there was never any investigation or prosecution.
Right.
So do you think he fired her simply for the straight up reasons he specified, or because perhaps she wasn't on board with the cover-up, or perhaps on the other side maybe he thought that she was involved in the crimes and wanted her just gone?
It's really hard to say because there's a lot of competing narratives about Paula Guillory, including from Paula Guillory herself. I interviewed her for my piece briefly, and she claimed to me that the missing evidence that she was fired for was evidence seized in a raid on Frankie Richard, and Frankie Richard's the prime suspect in several of these murders. This was a raid on Frankie Richard's house.
Uh-huh.
So she told me that she turned in the evidence and it simply disappeared. She didn't know what happened to it. She said that she was then terminated. And actually, the personnel file that I obtained on her, which contained the investigation into her activities, she had actually never even seen that, which I thought was really interesting too. And I was reading bits of it to her to have her respond, right, to the allegations in the investigation, and she had never heard any of them before. So she was very quickly moved out of her job. And, if you believe the investigation, the internal investigation into her, the reason is that she took something like $3,000 that was taken into evidence and essentially just stole it. And is that what happened? Well, I don't know. She says that's not what happened. The sheriff's office says that is what happened. When I interviewed Frankie Richard about it, and I quoted him about this in the piece, he made a comment which he meant kind of as a joke, but I took actually very seriously, which was, I want to thank Paula Guillory for stealing evidence in that case because it caused the charges against me and my mom to get dropped.
And Paula, she was pretty upset when she heard that, wasn't she?
She was really upset. I read that quote to her, and she was very upset about that. She claims she's just a good cop who was doing her job and really wanted to go after Frankie Richard. And then I have a number of people, including the private investigator who's working on the case, Kirk Bernard, who have told me that right around the time that Paula Guillory disappeared that evidence, she was observed at Frankie Richard's home socializing with him, and she was also observed at a house on the south side of Jennings that was basically a crack house where just about all of the women hung out. She was observed at this crack house also socializing with a number of people there.
Huh.
So,
well, I was going to ask, because we've kind of dipped our toe in the water about Frankie Richard. He seems to be at the middle of a lot of this stuff, and I'm just I haven't been able to wrap my brain around what exactly is his involvement in all of this.
Right, he is at the center of Frankie is at the center of the entire case because for a number of reasons. One, and this is by his own admission, he pimped out pretty much all but one of the women. The one exclusion being Ernestine Patterson, one of the early victims in 2005. So he pimped out all of these women. He also pimped them out from one specific place, and I wrote about this a bit in my piece, which is a motel that's right on I-10 called the Boudreaux Inn. So he and those women were doing their business out of the Boudreaux Inn. He was also, by his own admission, in at least two of the cases, and those would be Kristen Lopez and Whitney Dubois. He was one of the last people to be seen with at least two of the victims. And then he also, again by his own admission, had pretty significant fights or disagreements with at least two of the victims right before they were killed over drugs and money.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all of that, and then you also have the fact that Frankie's relationship with both the task force and the sheriff's office is very interesting, and suggests that he's both an informant for them and also someone who assists them in covering up the things that they do. I obtained an email exchange between Kirk Menard, the private investigator on the case, and one of the top-ranking members of the task force, where Menard says that he sent 2 witnesses over to be interviewed by the task force, and the task force told these witnesses that Frankie Richard works for them. You also have the witness statements that were taken by the Jennings police, where the witnesses say that Frankie Richard worked hand-in-hand with Chief Criminal Investigator Warren Gary to dispose of DNA evidence in the Kristen Gary Lopez case. So Frankie is deeply connected to the women, and he's deeply connected to law enforcement. He's very much at the center of this case.
And he's been accused of course, 2 of the murders, Kristen Lopez and Whitney Dubois.
He was charged in Kristen Lopez. He's never charged in Whitney Dubois. The circumstances around the death of Whitney Dubois, though, are highly suggestive that he was involved, because she was found in kind of a swampy area that has little crawfish ponds, very, very desolate area, and she was found on the road near one of these ponds by a guy who works kind of on the streets for Frankie Richard. And the guy claimed to have found her and claimed to have seen her something like a half mile away from where she was. And it just seems highly implausible that this guy would just suddenly pop up, in this desolate area where there's nothing around and find Whitney Dubois. And by the way, he happens to work for Frankie Richard too.
Actually, although at the same time, maybe he actually legitimately did, because if he'd just gone out there and disposed of the body and then turns around and says, "Hey, I found a body," I would tend to dissociate myself from dead bodies that I'm involved with.
One would think so, and that's a good point. Although there is actually this odd kind of phenomenon of, and I have this in another case that I'm working on, where someone who's involved in murder finds a body or claims to find a body, and they believe that it'll actually take suspicion off of them. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Like, I just look at me. I'm part of the search party, and I just happened to find this body. The man who found Dubois, his name is Jamie Trahan. He's a very close associate of Frankie Richard, and he presented it. And I spoke to Dubois, a number of people in the Dubois family, about the way Trahan presented himself to them after finding her body. And, he presented it as, I was just out here, and, I'm just trying to help, and I'm so sorry. And at one point, he even offered to put down quite a bit of money to help pay for her funeral expense, which the Dubois family also found incredibly suspicious.
That is a little odd.
You would think if you had any involvement in something like this, you'd want to be nowhere near it, especially if you were somebody who was so closely connected to Frankie Richard. But I think sometimes people think that by presenting themselves as like, this like innocent person who happened to stumble upon this horrible thing, that moves the spotlight off of them in some ways.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me, but...
Yeah, and as we're talking about Frankie Richard, there was a part in there where you were talking about Brittany Gary and the 3 men that were seen leaving the woods where she was found. What was it? Irvin, Eugene, and Ricardo?
That was actually not... That was Crystal Shea Benoit.
Oh, okay.
That was a different victim, yeah. And 3 men were seen. She was found in this wooded area on the outskirts of Jennings. And 3 men closely associated with Richard were seen leaving the wooded area. After her murder, And the man who saw them was a man named Russell Carrier, and Carrier mysteriously was run over by a train in Jennings. Yeah.
Yeah, that happens.
As soon after that witness identification, and law enforcement said it was a suicide, and his family does not believe it was a suicide.
Now, did he say? Did he at one point? I'm racking my brain here. I thought that when he was making the statements, did he tell somebody else that he was trying to figure out who had done it, and he had almost figured it out at one point? Or
that was the other guy. That was the brother of one of the.
That was yet another person, actually. Yeah, that was a drug dealer named Harvey Birddog Burleigh, who was very close to the Dubois family, and he said that he was, working the streets and gathering tips on the homicides, and then he was stabbed to death in Jennings, and his murder, he was stabbed to death in Jennings, I believe, in 2007, and his murder is unsolved as well. Yeah, I was just going to say quickly, that's another piece of this story that's so fascinating, which is you have 8 unsolved homicides in a town of 10,000 people, which is extraordinary. The fact that you have 8 homicides in that size of a town is extraordinary in itself, but the fact that all of them are unsolved is more extraordinary. But what adds even another level of craziness to this story is you have homicides like Birddog that are unsolved, and there's quite a few of them. So if you were to add up the 8 women plus the other unsolved homicides in town over the past decade or so, comes close to 20.
Oh, yeah. I didn't realize it was that high.
It's really just truly remarkable. And I can say, and I've been writing about crime and working in this field for a very long time, never seen anything like this anywhere. Both in terms of the level of law enforcement corruption and the number of homicides and the number of unsolved homicides. Such a small area.
It doesn't sound like they solved any homicides ever in that town.
They actually had a homicide early this year that they solved.
Good for them.
Which is, pretty unusual.
Yeah.
My interest in this story, actually, and this had to be taken out of the piece just for space reasons, began in 2011. I was out there visiting with Kirk Menard, the private investigator, just to get a sense of the story. And actually, within days of being out there, there was a murder of a drug dealer in Jennings named Bowlegs. And I actually just met Bowlegs the night before he was murdered. And, it was pretty amazing, and this had never happened to me before, where I was introduced to somebody and they were murdered the next day. And that murder, which dates back to either June or July of 2011, that murder is also unsolved. And Bowlegs also, by the way, dated at least 2 of the women who were killed in this case.
Did when you interviewed Bowlegs, did he give you any useful information?
No, it was just a introduction, very brief introduction to him. I didn't actually interview him. My trip back then was just essentially meeting people.
Yeah. So Bowlegs wasn't sitting on a powder keg of information, and he had to be silenced. More likely, he was.
I don't think so. I think he was, a casualty of some sort of drug beef, but his murder's unsolved, just like the rest of them, which is interesting.
Now, another piece in this whole story is that I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that of these 8 women, a number of them were present at a police shooting prior to their deaths?
Correct.
Correct,
yes.
So were all of them, or just a couple of them?
I thought it was just one.
Just a couple of them. Yeah, I've been able to confirm just one, which is Kristen Gary Lopez. I've heard, though, that it was 2 or perhaps 3. It was a shooting from April of 2005. It was a botched drug raid in South Jennings that was carried out by the DA's office, Louisiana Probation and Parole, the Sheriff's Office, and I believe the Police Department. They raided a drug house in South Jennings. The drug house was completely shrouded in darkness when they raided it. I don't think even the electricity was on. And for some unknown reason, one of the probation and parole agents opened fire on a man named Leonard Crochet, who apparently, witnesses say, had his hands up when he